because of the lack of representation about people like myself in academic textbooks and research that drove me to do my PhD, because, you know, I wanted, what I realized was that, you know, anything about black kids was always negative, was always in a negative light, rioting, mugging, or they were ignored. And I thought, well, I wasn't a rioter and I wasn't a mugger, and all the black kids I knew weren't rioters and muggers. And so why can't we tell their story? You know, so my PhD was about youth transitions, and it was about what I spoke to you about unemployment. So what my you know, the premise of my research was black young men, and are different to white young men, Asian young men. You know, they ultimately want a job. You know, they want a life to support their families. You know, everyone is the same, but it's what happens in your life that means that maybe you feel you can't grasp that linear you know, life transition. So you might take an alternative path, or you might divert from it and then come back to it later. So I was interested to look at the pathways of young black kids. So my research was, it was in the East London neighborhood, and it was looking at black young men and alongside white young men, black young women, white young women, so all their peers. And what I was trying to say was to compare and contrast. And ultimately what I was trying to say is, we can all start off looking at black young men as being different, but at the end of the day, reality is they're all the same. So I got into what we might call the crime aspect of things, gangs, what I call alternative transition.
Yeah.
What I say is that for some young men, you know, there's three pathways. There's, you either get a job, you leave school, you get a job, you go to college, or you go into the illicit economy. So, you know, what I call working on road. It's an alternative youth transition. So I was always fascinated by the alternative youth transition. And within the alternative youth transition is things like, you know, drug dealing, you know, fighting, but it's an understanding of crime linked to culture and socio and economics. You can't separate violence from violence in society. The point I'm trying to make, Tim, is that we're hypocritical about violence when it comes to the poorest in our communities. You know, violence is a societal problem that we inculcate our young men with from a very young age. We give them action men. You know, we want our sons to be tough and rough and look after. We don't want them crying, Nambi. We've got all these names for young soft boys, Nambi, Pambies, you know. And when boys go into the playground, and they then take on board these actions that we tell them to be a strong boy, just be my boy, be the man, you know. When they take that on and they go too far with it, in our opinions, we then say, oh, shocking, they're in a gang. What I'm trying to say, Tim, is that we're hypocritical about the problem and the scourge of violence only when it affects certain people who are at the lower echelons of society.
One thing we touched about when we talked before was that I wondered how you felt the landscape has changed since you published your book on gangs, race, and youth violence.
Yes.
There's a different landscape now.
It is a different landscape, and it's a landscape born out of hypocrisy again, in the sense that the government and the police went down a line of gangs. So they had their policies around ending gang and youth violence. Now, since 2010. Clearly, in 2000, the last spike we had over the past 18 months, clearly, you know, their policies have failed. You know? So rather than say, well, you know, our policies have failed because we were looking for gangs that didn't exist. You know, what has their policies failed? What hasn't failed is the fact that 52% of our prison estate is made up of young men of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds. 52%, which is just shocking. So, you know, and I think there's only something like maybe 8% of Black young men in the population, all 10% of young Muslims, a small percentage of traveller groups, because travellers also overrepresented, and then of course the hidden time bomb in all of this is the white groups, because white young men are underrepresented allegedly because they make up the majority of the population. But if we look at white working class young men, they make up, if they only make up 20 or 30% of the population, then they make up 50%. So there's an overrepresentation of all groups, whether it's race, ethnicity, religion, and class. And we need to accept that. That for some of our young men, so outside of London, it's white working class men in places like Middlesbrough, Scotland, or Manchester, the Northwest. For black young men, it's in the big cities like Bristol, Birmingham, and London, of course. And then, of course, Asian Muslim young men in places like Bradford. But one thing they all have in common is that they're all working, what we might call traditionally, historically working class, but they are from poor communities who would have, had jobs in the manual industries, and those that work has gone. Masculinity is around being tough. The work was about being tough, was about being physical. It was you were a breadwinner. You were the head of the household. These are masculinist things. But the one thing that's lost from all of that is masculinist jobs to match it. So let's remember all of that. So now the landscape that's changed is we now talk about county lines. Government's now talking about county lines. So again, driven by the police. Now, so it's more about, they're trying to pretend it's about safeguarding. So what they're trying to say is these young people now are victims. They've been sent to these different places to sell drugs, but ultimately it's just a different narrative of gangs. Has nothing to do with, and so county lines, all this county lines agenda, that still doesn't help us understand why some young people are getting involved in violence, in serious violence, why they're using knives, why some are using guns, and other violent acts, whether it's a beer bottle in Newcastle,
True.
Or in Cornwall. I was watching a program, I'm sure another interview did, when I was watching a white young man in Cornwall was telling the documentary about the culture, the pub culture, whereby it's a bare knuckle violent culture where violence is exceptionally horrendous, for these young men growing up in this part of the world. And I was shocked to hear about this. I did not know that these young men go through this ritual of extreme violence, and it's part of growing up. So there's pockets of this violence throughout the country, and and just focusing on black young men and gangs does this a service to the issue of violence across the board.